This is the fourth video in a series showing how to set up, configure, test, and debug the MVS Toolkit. In this video, we'll cover how to use the Toolkit Client IDE to configure web services, web service operations, and web service resources. Before we get started, let's talk about the difference between web service operations and web service resources. Functionally, the only difference between them is the format of the data that is returned. Web service operations, often referred to as SOAP services, typically return XML. Resources, often referred to as REST services, typically return JSON. And just in case you're wondering what some of these acronyms mean, SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. Some will call this RESTful. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And while we're at it, URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. And someone please tell me the difference. And WSDL stands for Web Service Definition Language. Now that that's out of the way, let's go create a web service. If you have not already done so, launch the Toolkit Client IDE. In the upper left-hand panel, right-click the web service provider and click Create Web Service. A dialog will pop up asking for a name and endpoint URL. Pick a name for the web service and put it in both text boxes. Next is the radio button group for the service type. As previously discussed, this default is SOAP, but the whole world is REST crazy, so you'll probably be clicking that radio button. Leave everything else alone unless you have a specific need for any of the authentication or WSDL stuff. Then click Finish and you're done. The system will now give you a confirmation dialog asking if you want to create a web service operation or resource depending on the service type you selected. We'll use the terms interchangeably for the rest of this tutorial. For now, click Yes and we'll define a web service resource. The MVS Toolkit can expose D3 data either directly from data files or by using basic subroutines. Let's start by creating a data resource for a REST web service. After clicking Yes on the previous dialog, you'll be presented with a Create a Web Service Resource dialog. Click the down arrow on the Database Connection dropdown and select the MV server you previously defined. Click the down arrow on the Account dropdown and select the MVSP-enabled account that contains the file you wish to use. In this tutorial, we'll use the MV demo account. If you have connection pool licenses on your D3 server, here's where you enable their use. Click the Advanced button and you'll get a new dialog asking you for minimum and maximum connections. I always set these two boxes to the same value. It's important to note that this dialog controls the number of connection pools used for all web service operations happening between one web service provider and one MV server, not just this web service operation. It may seem silly that a global setting like this is buried down in the web service operation area, but this was done because it was the only place where everything was available. So just remember, for one web service provider talking to one MV server, you only need to define this once, and any subsequent resources you define will use these same settings. When you click OK, you'll be returned to the Create a Web Service Resource dialog. Click Next to continue. You'll now be presented with the Create a Web Service Resource Type dialog. For SOAP operations, you'll be presented one radio button group allowing you to select data or catalog subroutine. For REST resources, you'll get that group and an additional group allowing you to use JSON or XML. Since we're creating a data resource in this example, click the Data button and click Next. You'll see a progress bar as the list of files in the selected account is generated. Then you'll be taken to the dialog on the next slide. You are now presented with the Construct the AQL Statement dialog. Enter the name of the web service resource that will appear in the URL. Select the file you want to use from the File Name dropdown. Below, you'll be presented with three tabs, the first of which defines what fields are sent back in the JSON payload. By default, all fields are defined by attribute defining items in the files dictionary are used. Check or uncheck the checkboxes next to the ADIs to include or exclude specific fields. You can also use the Select All and Deselect All buttons to clear your choices and start over. Notice that as you click and unclick that the AQL statement in the AQL statement box changes. When you click a field, it appears. When you unclick a field, it disappears. Note that you can control inclusion or exclusion, but not the field order. Now click the Selection Criteria tab. Click the Add button. Use the drop-down under the attribute name heading to select what field you'd like to use to narrow the number of items returned by the operation. Use the drop-down under the relational operator heading to select equal to, less than, or whatever you want for your selection. Under the value heading, you have a couple of choices. You can either use a literal value to use every time, or you can use the @ sign and a variable name, like @ID in this example. This is much more useful as it allows the caller of the web service operation to specify a different value with each request by including the $variable equals value in the URL they pass. See the example at the bottom of the slide. You can click Add to define as many selection criteria as you need and remove to get rid of any that you don't need. Note that you'll also need to select AND or from the drop-down under the logical operator heading if you have more than one selection criterion. Again, notice that as you add selection criteria, the AQL statement below reflects the additions and changes. Now click the Sort Criteria tab. Click the Add button. Use the drop-down under the attribute name heading to select what field you'd like to use to sort the items returned by the operation. Again, notice that as you add sort criteria, the AQL statement below reflects the additions and changes, the most notable being that list changed to sort. You can click back and forth among the output specification, selection, and sort criteria tabs all you want until you get the AQL statement of your dreams. Then click Finish to save the web service resource. In the next video, we'll talk about setting up and configuring a SOAP service using a D3 subroutine and how to define dynamic arrays. If you have any questions about any of the content we've covered so far, please contact Rocket D3 Support.